As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
Yes, a nice coup d'etat takes a lot of work. There you have Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, admitting very casually during a conversation with Jake Tapper that he has taken part in the planning process, the orchestrating of coups, which means essentially overthrowing leaders or governments in countries across the globe. He doesn't get too specific about what he's referring to, mostly because we're dealing with someone who's interviewing him who doesn't really seem to grasp how important it is to ask a follow-up immediately. We're gonna get to all of that in just a moment, but why don't we take a look at Bolton's statements in more context? They're having a discussion about the latest January 6th hearing. During that hearing, we saw more damning evidence indicating that Donald Trump was fully aware of what was about to go down on January 6th with rioters descending on the Capitol. It was interesting to say the least, right? But he used that as an opportunity to make a point about how, well, what Trump did cannot be classified as a coup. I would know a thing or two about coups. I'm much more sophisticated. So here he is making that point.
It's also a mistake, as some people have said, including on the committee, the commentators, that somehow this was a carefully planned coup d'etat aimed at the Constitution. That's not the way Donald Trump does things. It's rambling from one half-vast idea to another, one plan that falls through and another comes up. That's what he was doing. As I say, none of it defensible. But you have to understand the nature of what the problem of Donald Trump is. He's, to use a Star Wars metaphor, a disturbance in the force. And it's not an attack on our democracy. It's Donald Trump looking out for Donald Trump. It's a once in a lifetime occurrence.
I don't know that I agree with you. To be fair, with all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
So, does it not count as a coup if the attempt was an incompetent attempt? So it's only a coup if it's sophisticated enough in the mind of someone like John Bolton. But honestly, that to me is the secondary point, the secondary issue to get to, right? I think Bolton is completely wrong about his analysis in regard to what Donald Trump did. I think that the hearings that we've been seeing have displayed far more detail, far more evidence indicating that Donald Trump knew what was going on, was inciting the riots, both ahead of time and during the riots. I mean, you have to watch our coverage of it. You have to watch the hearings for yourselves if you haven't seen it. But to just simply minimize what the Trump camp did in the lead up to January 6th, and honestly, even after January 6th, is, in my opinion, indefensible, right? He keeps saying, oh, what Trump did is indefensible, but I wouldn't classify it as a coup because he's incompetent and I'm much more sophisticated and I would know what it's like to plan and orchestrate a coup. So let's get to that, because I think that part of the story is really, really interesting. Now, to be fair to Jake Tapper, he didn't ask a follow-up question about the coup comment immediately after Bolton made that statement. I don't know if a producer was in Tapper's ear and told him, hey, yo, maybe you want to follow up on what Bolton said about coups, maybe a little follow-up question there. I don't know what happened, but he did luckily eventually ask a follow-up question about it. Maybe we'll get more clarity about what John Bolton is referring to, so let's watch.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable. But I think there's another.
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me though.
I'm sure there is.
Oh, I'm sure there is, John Bolton. And unfortunately, since he didn't want to disclose more detail in regard to what other coups he took part in, or attempted coups he took part in, we're gonna have to speculate a little bit, but I've got some data that we'll get to. We'll get to some coups that were orchestrated under his watch as he was working for the State Department. But before we get to that, I just want to note that, John Bolton makes this case that US orchestrated coups in other countries where oftentimes we overthrow democratically elected leaders. He thinks that we do that. The US government does that to look out for our interests, right? Our interests meaning US citizens. It's great that we overthrow democratically elected leaders. It's great that we intervene and we overthrow a government of a foreign country because it benefits ordinary Americans. We're looking out for them. When in reality, whenever the United States orchestrates and executes a coup, they don't do it on behalf of the American people. They specifically do it on behalf of business interests within the United States. Oftentimes multinational corporations that can't stand the fact that left-wing leaders are nationalizing natural resources that these multinational corporations can take full advantage of and get rich off of. Again, these coups are not done to benefit anything or anyone other than business interests. It's always about profit. So we'll get into those details in a second. But what was amazing is that admission by Bolton did lead to some backlash, as it should. And when he was asked about that backlash, he decided to just kind of sum it all up as, well, it's a bunch of snowflakes crying. Let's watch.
The US is a world superpower, and were you surprised that some of the pickup there was about, your talk? Obviously, you've written about Venezuela a lot in your book.
Well, I think there are a lot of snowflakes out there that don't understand what you need to do to protect the United States. I'm not going to get into specifics. I did write about Venezuela in my memoir. And I think that any president that's not willing to do what it takes to protect the interests of the American people needs to have some counseling.
So there he is. First of all, calling people snowflakes when we're destroying other countries by orchestrating these coups, when we're using precious resources on those coups, when in reality we should be thinking about, hey, what can we do to actually take care of the American people who are, to be sure, suffering economically, suffering from a broken political system as well. It's not about benefiting ordinary Americans. He mentions Venezuela, that's the only thing he was specific about. And I also want to be clear that the Trump administration was trying to install someone who was not democratically elected, right? They wanted to overthrow the government under Nicolas Maduro and replace that government with Juan Guaido, not democratically elected. The people of Venezuela have not supported him. It's just a puppet for the United States that, again, the Trump administration tried to install. But I want to be clear, the Biden administration comes into power, and that's one of the first things that Biden said, that he recognizes Juan Guaido, someone who has not been elected as leader of Venezuela, as the rightful leader of Venezuela. Okay, so this is not a partisan issue. We have seen this type of trash foreign policy with both parties. And I want to be clear on that. Now let's move on though, because I want to talk about other potential coups that Bolton was probably part of. For instance, there was a successful coup. It was short-lived, but there was a successful coup in Bolivia back in 2019, again, under Donald Trump's watch. And what we know about this is that there was this accusation by the Organization of American States, OAS, that Evo Morales had not actually been reelected as the leader of Bolivia, that the election had irregularities. There was very likely fraud involved. Now, the OAS is mostly funded by the United States, and Bolivia, especially under a leader like Evo Morales, certainly has far more leftist policies that look out for the financial well-being, the economic well-being of their people, as opposed to the profit motive of multinational corporations. And so Evo Morales and the MAS party in Bolivia was a target. And unfortunately, the OAS comes in, they claim that there was election fraud without any evidence. Then you have the US media do exactly what it's paid to do, right? Just regurgitate that talking point, regurgitate these findings by the OAS without any real evidence. And Evo Morales ends up stepping down. He goes to Mexico, he flees to Mexico. And then what happens after that? Again, this is in 2019. So very likely John Bolton was part of this garbage, right? What happens after that? Well, then a right-wing authoritarian by the name of Janine Áñez just decides, I'm leader. She's installed as leader of Bolivia, even though she was not elected. There was no election for her. But she comes into power, she starts brutalizing the indigenous community in Bolivia. That leads to mass protests. And at the end of the day, the Bolivian people were so strong that they were able to overcome that coup. There was a special election held, and luckily another figure from the MAS party was elected, which gives you even more evidence that, hey, turns out that Evo Morales did not commit any type of election fraud. He would have very likely won if it weren't for the OAS getting involved and alleging that there was election fraud involved. So again, Janine Áñez, by the way, eventually ends up getting imprisoned because of her involvement in all of this. There was analysis by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which rejected the OAS's statistical analysis of the election of Evo Morales. They put out a report on this. There were human rights experts who also weighed in on the situation, and they concluded that Áñez's government's path to power came with irregularities. Okay, so there was some criminality in the way that they came into power, of course. And eventually she was convicted for charges committed during the political crisis. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison for this. And so, look, luckily Bolivia didn't have to deal with the same fate that Iran had to deal with as a result of the United States orchestrating a coup when its leader decided, hey, maybe we should nationalize our oil. This is in 1950 when Mohammad Mossadegh decided, no, why are we allowing business interests in other countries to get rich off of our natural resources? I'm gonna nationalize our oil. That's what he decided to do. By 1953, United States comes in and overthrows this democratically elected leader, and they installed the Shah. And now, all of a sudden, of course, you have the United States whining and crying about the religious zealotry that they see in Iran, how much of a threat Iran is under the leadership of these religious figures. We love doing this, right? We love going in, destabilizing countries. We did it in Guatemala, we did it in Iran, we do it all over the place. And then when these refugees flee these countries that we have destabilized, when they come to our border seeking refuge, seeking asylum, what do we do? What do people like John Bolton do? What do members of the Trump administration do? They cry about it. They whine about it. And to make matters worse, to add insult to injury, they point fingers at those refugees and they make them out to be dangerous individuals that we should all be afraid of. Now, the dangerous individuals sit in the Capitol building, in the White House, in the Pentagon. What they do is scheme and try to figure out ways to do right by business interests, right? They're the ones who go in and terrorize these countries by overthrowing these governments. And John Bolton just flat out admits it. He admits it during this interview with CNN. And I don't know why there was a delayed reaction from Jake Tapper, but that was a huge moment. And I wish Jake Tapper had just the historical context necessary to challenge Bolton on this a little more. And by the way, just going back to Bolivia for 1 second, why would we want to do or orchestrate a coup in Bolivia? Well, Elon Musk actually provided a lot of clarity on that. Now, when we're talking about electric vehicles, we need a very precious resource for that, lithium. We need lithium for that. And when it was very clear that the United States very likely engaged in orchestrating that coup in Bolivia in 2019, Elon Musk was very irritated by the fact that there was criticism toward that. And you know what he said on Twitter? We'll coup who we want. Because hey, Tesla's got to get their hands on that resource. They need that lithium for those electric vehicles. We'll coup who we want. So when we talk about state-sponsored terror, when we talk about all these shadowy, dangerous figures around the globe, those people exist, I'm not denying that. But I do think it's important to take a good hard look at what the United States has done through its foreign policy, how it has destabilized other countries, how that has led to refugee crises around the globe, and then maybe consider changing the way we approach foreign policy before we point fingers at other world leaders. I think that's an important thing to do. Recently, the Biden administration hosted the Summit of the Americas, which I attended to do some coverage at. And it was interesting because there were specific countries that were not invited. Cuba was not invited. Venezuela, not invited. And when I asked one of the individuals that I interviewed, actually the US ambassador to Mexico, about that, I was like, so why not? I mean, isn't this all about getting countries together, trying to move forward in a diplomatic way? And he gave me some nonsense answer. But the fact of the matter is, when you have countries that have decided, no, we're gonna nationalize our resources and we're not gonna allow multinational corporations to take advantage of us, well, there's no business deal to be made. And that entire summit was all about getting US business interests together with Latin American leaders who are willing to open up their country to be exploited by these business interests. That's what's really going on. So when John Bolton talks about these things, when he talks about how it's gonna benefit the American people, when it's about national security, I know that you guys are probably already smart enough to know it's BS, but I'm here to just really confirm that and emphasize it is BS. Finally, a few more things I wanted to add. So since Bolton joined the government under the Reagan administration in 1982, there have been more than 350 coup attempts around the world. Nearly 150 of them have been successful. Now, of those 350 plus coups, 191 occurred when Bolton held a position with the US government. That figure, however, includes coups that occurred when Bolton was serving in positions that one might assume were less coup adjacent, like serving as an assistant administrator of the US Agency for International Development, USAID, or serving as an assistant attorney general in the Justice Department. But let's take a look at what has transpired under a State Department where Bolton is an employee, right? So Bolton joined the State Department in October of 1989. There was an attempt to oust Panamanian dictator Manuel Antonio Noriega. He was removed from power following an American invasion that December. By the way, you wanna know who empowered Manuel Noriega in Panama? The United States. In fact, George H.W. Bush had been working with the homie since the 1960s. But once Noriega started to become a little too much of a liability for the United States, all of a sudden we gotta oust the guy. We gotta overthrow, we need regime change. And that's what the United States did in 1989, in December of 1989. Let's get to some more of these coups. In 1992. A coup in Afghanistan similarly led to the ouster of the country's leader, a longtime ally of the Soviet Union. There was also coup attempts in a number of other countries while Bolton served under President George H.W. Bush, including the Philippines, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, and Romania, where they ousted the general secretary. Bolton then returned to government under Bush's son, George W. Bush. Besides the invasion of Afghanistan, perhaps the most significant coup tracked by the Klein Center's coup d'etat project was the March 2004 removal of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was the president of Haiti at the time. Now, he blamed American actors for the coup, but other countries saw similar attempts, including the November 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia that ousted the country's Soviet allied leader. So it is interesting, right? Oftentimes when we see these coups take place, when there is some suspicion regarding the United States orchestrating those coups, it's always when there is fears of a communist takeover, fears of a leftist leader nationalizing national resources. And again, there is a very clear reason for that. It's because when a country nationalizes their resources, the individuals who benefit and profit from those resources are the people of that country. And multinational corporations ain't having that. So they rally the troops. the US troops and the United States government to do what it does best in most cases, which is, again, overthrow these leaders to open the doors up for these business interests. Bolton admitted that in his own way, and if anyone finds that morally just wrong, if anyone has a problem with that, you're just a snowflake. You're just crying about it. Also, I don't know why we have all these refugee crises all around the world. I don't know why people are seeking refuge and asylum here in the United States. What's going on? It's all connected, guys. It's really important to pay attention to what we do in regard to foreign policy, because it does have an impact, not only on us, but on people all across the globe who don't deserve to suffer in the name of multinational corporations.